When your teacher can fly at Mach 20, middle school math problems might seem, well, a bit trivial. But of course, if that teacher deeply cares about your education, then you don't really have a choice, do you? Assassination Classroom is just as absurd as it is endearing, and it helps that, at least for one particular scene, the author beautifully incorporates a math problem into its themes. Oh, and for good measure... Okay, I'll stop doing that. It's Season 2, Episode 12. Students are taking their final exams. We follow two, Karma and Asano, who look suspiciously similar. They're both stuck on this one problem here. Pause if you'd like, but I'll cover it more in depth in a sec. Karma is coming off of a previous failure during midterms, and he has new insights he's learned by observing and appreciating the people around him. Asano, the principal's son, is single-mindedly determined to prove his father wrong about education. Both of them are competing for the high score on the math exam, and they're the only two who have a chance at acing it. Okay, so let's look at the problem. We have a point at the center of a cube. We want to find the volume of the domain of points that is closer to the center than to any of the corners. Thematically, well, the show isn't the subtlest. This problem is used to show the difference in mindset between our two characters. Just to spell it out for you, the center point represents Karma and Asano respectively, the individual, while the corners represent other people in their lives. Asano is closed off. As a result of his upbringing, he sees all others as enemies, hence why he shoots the corner. This is in fact a valid method of approaching the problem. If we draw lines from the center to the corners, then the planes that bisect those lines will be the boundaries of our domain. And if we expand those planes while still keeping them inside the cube, we have the shape of our domain. As a side note, this region is actually super important in crystallography, and it's known as a Wigner Seitz cell. This is still pretty ugly though. I bet most of you have no idea how you would even go about finding the volume of this shape, though I do encourage you to try. Asano, being a genius, does quickly find a method. What he's saying with his gun there is, if we take the space that our domain doesn't take up while still being inside the cube, the negative space as it would be called, it's made up of two different shapes. Hexagonal pyramids, 8 of them, and then this weird wedge shape, 12 of them, which he splits up into a tetrahedron, so there's 24 of those. Regardless, the calculation is still pretty nasty. So Asano's brute force method fails him. The show doesn't actually show him doing the problem, so you can see me on the screen doing it on paper. I won't bother going over this, as it's really just a lot of tedious geometry, but feel free to pause and or work it out yourself. Now, Karma, on the other hand, notices something. Instead of treating the corners as enemies, he realizes that there's more points outside of the cube. Taking a global look at things, every point will have their own identical domain. Just like we as individuals can only see a part of other people's lives, only 1/8 of the corners are actually inside the box. Even though your life might be centered on you, you are the corner to other people's lives. In this crystal, to occupy a given box this way, thus, everyone's domain accounts for 1/8. 8 corners making up a whole sphere. Okay, I admit that might have been hard to follow. I didn't get it until probably the 5th rewatch, so let's break it down. I've scaled things down a dimension to make it easier to visualize, and the concepts I show here will directly scale up to 3D. We have a square with side length A. It then has area A squared. Taking Asano's approach first, we draw lines from the center of the square out to the corners. We can then bisect those lines. Then, this rotated square in the center is our domain. Luckily, in 2 dimensions, the area of this is much easier to calculate. You should be able to see that it has side length a over root 2. Then, the area is a squared over 2, or half the area of the full square. But then, if we think of this square as part of an infinite lattice, we notice that our center point, which is the center of a square from one point of view, is the corner of another square. And the bottom right corner is now the center. In fact, every point in this lattice is both a center and a corner. It just depends on which square we care about. But since none of the squares are unique, every point must be identical. And thus, the domain around one center point must be the domain around every other center point. I'll now blow up the dots to make this next part clearer. Exactly 1/4 of each corner is inside the square. We can put these together to make a full circle. The same logic applies to the domain and area. Exactly 1/4 of each corner's domain is inside the square. Thus, combining the domains of all 4 corners adds up to one full domain. So, we know that the ratio of areas associated with one point to another point must be 1:1. There are 2 circles inside the square, the center one and the one composed of the 4 corners. These correspond to the domains inside the square, the corner domain and the center domain. From what we know, these must add up to the whole area of the square, and the areas must be the same. Thus, they must both have values of a squared over 2. This method might seem a bit convoluted for the system I've just shown, but for the 3D situation of the original problem, this sort of reasoning allows us to not have to do any complicated geometry. If you'd like to, try to use both Asano's method, bisecting lines, and Karma's method to find out the volume or the area of the domain for this hexagonal lattice. It's not very common for a work of fiction to get math correct. And it's much less common for it to incorporate the methods of approaching a math problem into its thematic message. In fact, this is the only example I can think of right now. Even if it is possible to do things on your own, relying on others can often make things much easier and open up a path you would have never dreamt up by yourself. Asano uses a perfectly valid method, but because he's so focused in on himself, he fails to see the bigger picture, which Karma does. There's nothing wrong with the brute force geometric approach, but the symmetrical argument Karma finds is frankly beautiful. If you've seen the show, you know that Karma at the beginning of it would have zero chance at finding his elegant solution. But by connecting with the people around him, his friends, and of course his teacher Karo-sensei, Karma literally solves a math problem with the power of friendship.